your worst experience with bad neighbors? Story 1. I've had my fair share of bad neighbors, but one experience stands out. It all started when my new neighbors moved in next door. They seemed nice enough, but as time went on, their true colors showed. It began with them leaving their trash cans out on the front lawn for days. Then, they started parking their beat-up van on the curb, blocking my driveway so I couldn't get in or out of my own house. I politely asked them to move it, but they just shrugged and continued doing it. One night, they hosted a party that went on until 4 a.m. Music blasting, people yelling, and random cars parked all over the street. When I knocked on their door to ask if they could quiet down, they yelled back, "It's a free country, get over it!" The next day, I called the police because it wasn't the first time they had disrupted the neighborhood. And finally, they got fined for noise complaints. But it didn't stop there. Every time I saw them, they would give me passive-aggressive looks or make snide remarks. The worst part was that they started leaving their dog out in the yard all day and night, barking nonstop, which was unbearable. The experience with them left me constantly stressed. And eventually, they moved out, but only after causing chaos in the neighborhood for over a year. I will never forget the stress they brought into my life. Story 2. I live in an apartment complex, and for the most part, it's peaceful. That is, until I moved in next to a couple who were, well, less than ideal. From the start, they would argue loudly at all hours of the night, which made it almost impossible to sleep. But it didn't end there. The real trouble began when they started smoking inside their apartment. Despite the building being non-smoking, they lit up anyway. It wasn't just cigarettes either. The smell of weed would seep through the walls, often making the whole hallway reek. One day, I tried to speak to them about it politely, asking if they could smoke outside. They looked at me as if I were crazy and told me to mind my business. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. They started leaving food outside their door, attracting pests like rats and cockroaches. My kitchen, which was on the other side of the wall, started to smell like a garbage dump because of the rotting food. When I contacted the landlord, they said they couldn't do much because it was a personal issue. It took months for the neighbors to finally move out after the landlord issued multiple warnings, and I was so relieved when they did. But those months were some of the most miserable I've ever had in that apartment. The constant noise, smoking, and filth really tested my patience. The landlord's lack of action didn't help either. I just hope no one else has to deal with neighbors like that. Story 3. I've lived in my house for 10 years now, and the neighbor situation has always been pretty good until the new neighbor moved in next door. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a few weeks I started to notice some strange behavior. Every time I pulled into my driveway, the neighbor would stand by his window and watch me like a hawk. It wasn't just occasional, it was every time I came home or left. I tried to shrug it off at first, but it got to a point where it felt creepy. Then, one day, I was outside watering my plants when he came over and asked if I wanted to hang out. He invited himself to my backyard without asking, sitting on my patio and chatting about the most awkward topics. He didn't seem to take a hint that I wasn't interested in spending time with him. After that, he began popping by unannounced, always at the most inconvenient times. One day, he even asked to use my bathroom while I was in the middle of cooking dinner for my family. I eventually had to tell him bluntly that I appreciated my privacy and didn't want him over without an invitation. He was taken aback but seemed to understand. Since then, he's respected my space, but I still get the feeling he's lurking around when I'm not home. It made me so uncomfortable for months, and I still find myself checking the window before I step outside just in case. Story 4. I used to live in a small town and the people there were generally friendly. But I had this one neighbor who made it her mission to make my life difficult. It started with her constantly complaining about the noise from our kids playing outside. No matter what time it was, she would call me or knock on my door to tell me they were too loud. My kids were just playing, nothing excessive, but she would act like we were disrupting the whole neighborhood. At first, I tried to accommodate her, telling my kids to play inside more, but she was never satisfied. One day, she called animal control on me because our dog had been barking for a few minutes while I was running errands. It was an absolute nightmare. She was always watching and reporting every little thing we did, from trimming the trees in our yard to how we parked our cars. The final straw came when she tried to get us evicted for something as silly as a misplaced lawn chair, which was clearly not an issue. I started avoiding her altogether, but she didn't give up. She even tried to convince other neighbors to report me for trivial things, but luckily they all saw through her. Eventually, she moved out, and I can honestly say that was the best day ever. I've had neighbors before and since, but none came close to being as miserable as her. It's wild how one person can make you dread coming home every day. Story 5. I live in a duplex, and for a while it was just me and my neighbor, who was pretty quiet. But that changed when his girlfriend moved in. She immediately started making a ruckus. Loud music at all hours of the night, parties, and people coming in and out of the house at all hours. I let it slide for a few weeks, hoping it was just a phase, but it only got worse. One night, I went over and knocked on the door to ask if they could keep it down, as it was almost 3 a.m. His girlfriend answered, and instead of being apologetic, she slammed the door in my face and yelled through the door that I was a buzzkill. The next day, I decided to call the non-emergency line to report a noise disturbance. The police arrived, and the girlfriend was furious. They got a warning, but the next few nights were even worse. There was yelling, breaking glass, and shouting at the top of their lungs. I had to sleep with earplugs in every night, and I was constantly exhausted from the lack of sleep. Finally, they got evicted due to complaints from other tenants, and my life went back to normal. But I'll never forget how they turned a peaceful living situation into a nightmare. It was one of the worst experiences I've had with neighbors. Story 6. When I first moved into my new apartment, I was excited about starting fresh. It was in a nice neighborhood with everything within walking distance. But the excitement quickly faded when I met the neighbor living directly above me. From the first night, it was clear something wasn't right. Every single night, around midnight, he would blast heavy metal music at full volume. I'm talking about the kind of bass that rattled the walls and the floor beneath me. I'd try to ignore it at first, thinking maybe it was just a one-off, but it quickly became a pattern. I tried knocking on his door once to ask him to turn it down. He answered, looking a little disoriented, but immediately shut the door in my face when I explained my issue. Over the next few weeks, I tried various approaches to solve the problem, including emailing the management office and calling security, but nothing worked. It got so bad that I would dread even trying to fall asleep, knowing the music would start soon. One night, the noise was unbearable, and I finally snapped. I called the police. They arrived, and he didn't answer the door, but they issued a noise complaint. After that, the music stopped. For about a month, I enjoyed the quiet once again. But just as I thought things were getting better, I started hearing what sounded like a mini bowling alley above me. Turns out, he was into late-night weightlifting, dropping dumbbells on the floor repeatedly. This went on for months until I ended up moving to a different unit in the building. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant noise and complete lack of respect for others' living space made my life miserable. Story 7. I live in a townhouse, and a few years ago, my neighbor moved in. They were a quiet couple, or at least that's how it seemed at first. But then one day, I began to notice that their front porch was starting to look like a junkyard. Old couches, broken chairs, and even mattresses started piling up outside. I initially thought maybe they were cleaning, or going through a renovation. But it never stopped. A few months later, I realized that it wasn't just the porch that was the problem. They started leaving trash bags on the sidewalk and in their yard. The smell became unbearable. I even noticed the bags sometimes tore open, spilling food waste and other debris all over the place. I went over and politely asked if they could clean up the area, mentioning the odor and how it was attracting rats. They didn't seem to care. At this point, I reached out to our homeowners association to report the issue. They did nothing for weeks, claiming that as long as the junk wasn't in the street, it was technically allowed. This dragged on for months and it became a constant eyesore. But the worst part was when they started hoarding things in the garage, including old electronics and boxes of random stuff that didn't seem to be from any move. Eventually, they had so much junk that I started to worry about fire hazards. The whole situation felt unsafe and disrespectful, and there was no end in sight. I decided to escalate things further by reaching out to local health inspectors. They came by, and thankfully, after some official warnings, the neighbors started clearing things up. But by that point, I'd already lost all patience. I was tired of living next to a junkyard. It took months to fully get the place back to normal, and the entire experience left me disillusioned with how little people sometimes care about their surroundings. Story 8. I've always been a pretty laid-back person, but one particular neighbor tested my patience in ways I never thought possible. He was a single man who moved into the house next door. For the first few months, I didn't even notice him, as he kept to himself. But things took a turn when he started parking his car in front of my driveway. At first, I thought maybe it was an accident or he didn't realize the inconvenience, so I let it slide. But this quickly became a regular occurrence. I was unable to park in my own driveway at least 5 times a week, and I was furious. I tried to talk to him about it, but he just shrugged and said, "You've got a big driveway, just park somewhere else." After that, I'd try calling him on the phone or knocking on his door to ask him to move the car, but he always ignored me. It was like he did it on purpose. The situation got worse when he started leaving his trash cans in front of my driveway as well. I called the city to file a complaint, but that didn't seem to have any effect. In the end, I had to call a tow truck multiple times just to get his car removed. That didn't stop him, though. He'd park there again and again, and each time I had to go through the same process. It wasn't just the parking issues that made living next to him awful. He also had a habit of playing loud music during the day when I worked from home. When I asked him to turn it down, he simply turned it up louder. It felt like he was deliberately trying to make my life miserable, and eventually, I just started avoiding him altogether. After several months of this, I moved out. No one should have to deal with that kind of disrespect. Story 9. I've lived in my building for years, and while it's not the most glamorous place, it was always quiet and peaceful, until the new neighbors moved in. A young couple, both in their early 20s, moved in next door, and from day one, they were loud. They would have parties on weekdays with people coming and going at all hours of the night. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came when they decided to get a dog. They left the poor animal in their apartment, and it barked nonstop for hours, every single day. It started at 8 a.m., and I could hear it all day long, even with my windows shut. I tried going over to politely ask them to train their dog, or at least get a dog sitter while they were at work. But when I knocked on their door, they ignored me. Eventually, I had to leave a note on their door. They didn't even acknowledge it. It was so bad that I couldn't even enjoy a single weekend without hearing that dog bark for hours. I tried calling animal control, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless the barking continued through the night. The neighbors didn't seem to care at all. After a few months, I ended up filing a formal noise complaint, but by then, the damage was done. The entire building was talking about how loud and inconsiderate they were, and it made living there so uncomfortable. Fortunately, they eventually moved out, but the experience was terrible. I'll never forget how it felt to live with such disrespectful neighbors. It was a complete violation of my peace and privacy, and I learned the hard way that sometimes you can't rely on others to do the right thing. Story 10. I've always been a bit of a homebody, and I like my space. My neighbors, however, seemed to have no concept of personal boundaries. It all started with one of them asking me for a favor. They wanted to borrow my lawnmower. I was a bit hesitant, but agreed. Big mistake. Over the course of the next few weeks, they began asking for more and more favors. They'd need something from me nearly every day. A cup of sugar, a ride to the store, you name it. The requests were never ending, and it became draining. At first, I thought they were just friendly and wanted to help out, but then it became clear that they were taking advantage of my kindness. They would knock on my door at the most inconvenient times, even when I was in the middle of something important. If I ever politely told them I was busy, they'd give me a guilt trip, claiming I didn't care about being a good neighbor. One day, I came home to find that they had borrowed my hose to water their plants without asking, and they'd left it lying on my lawn, tangled up. That was the breaking point. I politely told them that I wasn't comfortable with the constant requests and I needed some space. They didn't take it well. They gave me the cold shoulder for weeks and started spreading rumors about me to other neighbors, making it seem like I was the one causing problems. Eventually, things calmed down, but I learned an important lesson. Being too accommodating to bad neighbors can turn into a nightmare. I never made that mistake again. Story 11. When we first moved into the house next door, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors friendly, and the kids played outside without any trouble. But that all changed when the neighbor on the other side of our house moved in. At first, I thought he was a nice guy, a single man, a little older than me, but generally friendly and polite. That is, until I noticed the odd behavior that started to escalate over time. It began when I noticed he was always watching us from his window. I would often catch him peering out from behind the curtains, as if monitoring every move we made. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just coincidence, but it kept happening. One day, he even waved at me from his window, which I thought was strange, but I waved back out of politeness. Things started getting worse when he began showing up uninvited to our backyard. I'd be in the middle of grilling or spending time with my family when he would walk up to the fence, stand there, and start making small talk. It felt incredibly intrusive, and no matter how politely I'd tell him that we needed space, he'd keep showing up. One time, he even climbed over the fence to check out the new shed we built. I was beyond uncomfortable. The tipping point came when he started asking very personal questions, like how long I had been married and how much money I made. I was completely taken aback by how invasive he was. I tried to avoid him, but he would knock on my door at random times, often during dinner, with some excuse to talk. He'd complain about trivial things, like how our car was parked or how he didn't like the color of our fence. It was clear he had no boundaries. After a particularly uncomfortable conversation where he insisted on walking around our house with, I had enough. I called the police and explained that I was concerned for my family's privacy and safety. The authorities told him to stay away from our property, and we never saw him again. It was such a relief to finally feel safe again in our own home, but the whole ordeal left me shaken. It made me realize that sometimes, even seemingly nice neighbors can have some seriously weird tendencies. Story 12. My family and I have always been good at keeping to ourselves, but our new neighbor didn't seem to understand the concept of privacy. The day they moved in, we were excited about having new neighbors, but the excitement quickly faded once we got to know them. The couple was in their mid-30s, and they had a young child, so initially, we thought they'd be a good addition to the neighborhood. However, within a week, It became clear that they were much more intrusive than we ever imagined. At first, it was just little things like them knocking on our door to introduce themselves, which we thought was fine. But then they started popping over unannounced at all hours of the day, sometimes multiple times a day, asking to borrow things or asking if we needed help with anything. They'd show up when we were clearly busy, and if we politely declined, they'd act offended and leave, but not without making some passive-aggressive comments about how they were just trying to be friendly. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was when they started showing up for dinner. They'd knock on our door, telling us they were in the neighborhood and thought they'd come by for a quick chat, only to sit down at the table and refuse to leave. At first, we tried to politely ask them to leave, but they would just ignore us and keep talking, as if they didn't realize they were overstaying their welcome. One time, they even invited themselves to my son's birthday party, and when I told them it was a family-only event, they showed up anyway and stayed the entire time. It wasn't just the unannounced visits, it was the lack of respect for boundaries. They started asking about our personal finances, how much we paid for our house, and how much our utilities cost. It felt like they were prying into areas of our life that were none of their business. After multiple attempts to set boundaries, we ended up having to get the landlord involved. Eventually, they were asked to leave the property, but by then, they had already caused so much stress that we decided to move to a different neighborhood. It's amazing how quickly a friendly neighbor can turn into an uncomfortable nightmare. Story 13. The Neighbor from Hell. That's the only way I can describe the woman who lived next door to me for several years. She was a retired woman in her late 60s, and she seemed harmless enough at first, just a sweet old lady who enjoyed gardening and chatting over the fence. But soon, I realized that her harmless demeanor hid a darker side. It all started when she began criticizing the way we maintained our yard. She would frequently come over to tell us that our lawn wasn't cut properly, our flowers weren't the right color, or that we had weeds growing in places we hadn't noticed. I thought it was just her being picky at first, but it soon escalated into an obsession. She started leaving notes on our door with unsolicited advice on everything from home repairs to parenting. The real trouble began when she started calling the city on us for the smallest infractions. She complained to animal control because our dog barked a little too much while we were at work, and even reported our fence for being slightly tilted, which she claimed was a safety hazard. I knew she was trying to make us miserable, but what could we do? The breaking point came when I was in the process of painting our house, and she decided to come over and help. I politely told her I appreciated her offer, but that I had it covered. She didn't take kindly to that and started to sabotage the job. She'd sneak up behind me and repaint sections I had just finished, only to criticize my technique. One day, she even took it a step further and poured paint all over my tools when I wasn't looking. It felt like she was purposely trying to ruin everything we did. I finally had enough and made a formal complaint to the HOA about her interference and harassment. After some tense meetings, they gave her a formal warning, and she eventually toned it down. But by that point, the damage had been done. I couldn't wait to move. It's hard to imagine how one person could make a peaceful neighborhood so toxic, but she did just that. Story 14. My nightmare neighbor saga started when I had to move to a new town for work. The house I rented was great, but my next-door neighbor was anything but. He was a middle-aged man who kept to himself, but it wasn't long before I started to notice strange behavior. The first red flag was when I caught him sneaking around the back of my house one evening. I was in my living room when I saw him lurking near my windows, peeking inside. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but then it happened again the next week. I decided to confront him the next time I saw him and asked why he was always near my house. He seemed completely unfazed and explained that he was just curious about what was going on in my backyard. That was enough to send chills down my spine. I kept my distance from him after that, but the situation didn't improve. He began leaving strange notes on my car, talking about how he liked my garden or how he noticed I hadn't been around for a few days. Things got more intense when I went on vacation and came back to find that my fence had been tampered. A section of it was loose, and it seemed like someone had been trying to break into my yard. I was creeped out, but I didn't have any proof. I installed security cameras around my property, and within days I caught him on tape trying to sneak into my backyard. I immediately reported him to the police, and they investigated the situation. Turns out, he had a history of similar incidents with other neighbors in the area. The police warned him to stay away from my property, and I made sure to keep a close eye on things after that. Thankfully, after a few months of constant vigilance, he moved away, and I never had to deal with him again. The whole experience was unsettling, but it taught me to trust my instincts and be aware of the red flags that some neighbors can present. Story 15. I live in a relatively quiet neighborhood, but that peace was shattered when a new family moved in next door. They were a loud, chaotic bunch with two teenage boys who seemed to have no respect for anyone around them. It started with them blasting music late into the night, often until 3 or 4 a.m. with the bass so loud that my walls would shake. The worst part was that it was an almost nightly occurrence, and when I tried to talk to them about it, they just laughed it off. At first, I didn't want to escalate the situation, so I tried calling the police about the noise, but they never seemed to show up in time. I reached out to the HOA to complain, but they seemed indifferent as well. Things got worse when the teenage boys started vandalizing the neighborhood. They would throw eggs at cars, spray paint fences, and even break a few windows in the area. No one wanted to confront them, fearing retaliation, so it felt like we were all just living under constant stress. One day, I came home to find that they had stolen my lawnmower. I was furious. I called the police and reported it, but I didn't hold out much hope. Fortunately, after some investigation, they managed to trace the lawnmower back to their garage. When the police confronted them, they admitted to stealing it, along with other items from different neighbors. They were fined and had to pay restitution. Afterward, they moved away, and the neighborhood finally returned to its quiet self. But those months of stress and tension are not something I'll ever forget. Story 16. When I first moved into my new apartment, I was excited. It was spacious, clean, and in a quiet neighborhood. I never thought much about the neighbors since I was used to the usual city noise, but that all changed the moment I met the couple who lived across the hall. At first, they seemed like a nice young couple. They'd wave hello in the hallway, and we'd occasionally chat for a few minutes. But then, it started getting weird. I agreed, not thinking much of it. But after that, it was like I became their personal errand runner. They would knock on my door with requests for things like borrowing sugar, picking up their mail, or even feeding their fish when they went on weekend trips. While I thought it was nice to help out, it began to feel like they were taking advantage of me. It wasn't just small favors either. One evening, they asked if I could watch their dog for a few hours while they ran errands. I reluctantly agreed, but when I got there, they were gone for more than 6 hours and their dog was left in a cage with no water. That was the last straw for me. The situation only escalated after that. They would knock on my door at all hours of the day and night, asking for things or just wanting to chat. I started avoiding them, but they would still pop by uninvited. Eventually, I got fed up and started ignoring their knocks. When they realized they weren't getting what they wanted from me anymore, they started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my door, calling me rude and inconsiderate. I finally had enough and filed a complaint with the landlord. The next time they came to me with another ridiculous request, I told them I couldn't help and that they needed to respect my space. They moved out shortly after, and I couldn't have been more relieved. The experience taught me to always be cautious about being too accommodating to people who don't respect boundaries. Story 17. I've always had a fairly decent relationship with my neighbors, until one particular couple moved in next door. They were a bit younger than my wife, and at first we thought they'd be a great addition to the neighborhood. They were friendly and always waving whenever we saw them. But within the first few weeks of their move, things began to spiral out of control. The couple had a large dog, a massive, unruly breed, that they kept outside all day and night. The dog would bark relentlessly, day and night, without pause. We tried to ignore it at first, hoping they'd take care of it, but it only got worse. The dog's barking seemed to have no end, and it made it nearly impossible to enjoy any peace or quiet at home. After weeks of this, we politely mentioned it to them, hoping they would bring the dog inside during the night. They told us that the dog liked being outside and that it wasn't a problem. The barking persisted, but then came the smell. With the dog left outside all the time, it didn't take long for the area around their house to start smelling of urine and waste. I could smell it whenever I stepped outside, and it only got worse as time went on. It felt like no one in the neighborhood could escape it. The couple's lack of care for the dog, combined with their complete disregard for their neighbors, was becoming unbearable. Things took another turn when they began throwing wild parties on weekends. The music would blare into the early hours of the morning. The house would be filled with strangers, and the noise never seemed to stop. We'd knock on their door and ask them to keep it down, but the couple always brushed us off, claiming that they were entitled to have fun. Finally, after months of constant complaints to the landlord and city council about the noise, the dog, and the unsanitary conditions, they were forced to move. The relief I felt when they left was indescribable, but the damage had already been done. Their carelessness made living next to them a nightmare, and I'll always remember the frustration of living next to neighbors who had no respect for the people around them. Story 18. I've always been a pretty patient person, but nothing tested my limits more than the neighbors who lived next door when I was in my 20s. The first sign that things weren't going to go well was when I realized that the couple next door was incredibly loud. I thought maybe it was just the honeymoon phase, but it quickly became clear that they were consistently noisy. They would argue at all hours of the day and night, often yelling at each other, even at 2 a.m. The walls in our building weren't that thick, so it was like we were right there with them. It was impossible to get a decent night's sleep. I tried to be understanding at first. Everyone has a rough day, right? But the constant bickering became unbearable. After a while, they began throwing things. I could hear objects slamming against the walls. It sounded like a full-blown fight was taking place every other night. When I went to confront them about the noise, they just laughed it off and said it was no big deal. I was left feeling incredibly uncomfortable, knowing that I couldn't escape the tension in the air. But that wasn't even the worst part. A few months into their tenancy, I realized that their parties had become a weekly event. They would host a party every Friday night, sometimes lasting until the early hours of the morning. The music would pound through the walls, the laughter and shouting echoing in the hallway. It was absolutely impossible to ignore. I tried talking to them multiple times, explaining that the noise was keeping me awake, but they never apologized. Instead, they told me to deal with it since it was the weekend. After trying everything from polite requests to calling the landlord, nothing changed. They kept partying, kept arguing, and kept making my life miserable. I eventually moved out to get away from the constant drama. The experience was exhausting, and I learned that some people simply have no regard for others' peace of mind. It left me with a deep distrust of certain neighbors, and I still remember the sleepless nights I endured during that time. Story 19. I've been living in my apartment complex for about 3 years, and for the most part, it's been peaceful. However, everything changed when a new tenant moved in right next door. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but soon it became clear that my new neighbor had some rather unusual habits. She was an older woman who lived alone, and she seemed nice enough at first. But she quickly became known for her bizarre obsession with cleanliness. She would spend hours every day sweeping, vacuuming, and scrubbing every inch of her apartment. It was relentless. But what really started to get strange was when I noticed she was constantly taking out bags of trash, often several times a day. At first, I assumed she was just cleaning up frequently, but then I started to realize that the bags never seemed to end. One day, I decided to ask her what was going on. She told me that she had a special cleaning routine and was just getting rid of the old stuff. Things took a turn when she started leaving bags of trash in the hallway outside her door. The bags would pile up, and I noticed a smell beginning to linger. I was concerned, so I spoke to her again, asking if she needed help with her trash. She insisted she didn't, but the bags continued to stack up. One night, I opened my door to find that she had left several bags right in front of my door. A few had even ripped open, spilling old food onto the floor. The hallway started to smell so bad that I couldn't even go outside my apartment without gagging. I reported the situation to the building management, who eventually had to get involved. They sent pest control to take care of the issue, and the trash was finally removed. But it didn't end there. She began leaving notes for me, accusing me of trying to get her kicked out for no reason. I never realized how much one neighbor could make living in an apartment building a nightmare until that experience. Story 20. I've lived in a small neighborhood for most of my life, and overall, I've always had a great relationship with my neighbors. But then, a new family moved in across the street. At first, I thought they were just a typical family with young kids, but I quickly realized something was off. It wasn't their kids who were the problem, it was the parents. They had a rather odd habit of being extremely invasive. At first, they would wave and chat over the fence when I was outside, which I thought was friendly. But soon, it became clear they wanted to be involved in every aspect of my life. The father would drop by without notice to offer unsolicited advice on lawn care, gardening, and even how to manage my finances. The mother was just as bad. She would pop over to my house, uninvited, and tell me about every personal issue she thought I was having. I found this very intrusive, but I didn't want to cause a scene, so I politely told them I preferred to handle things on my own. But the worst part came when they started interfering with my own children. They would send their kids over to play at my house, which was fine at first. But soon, they started dictating how my kids should behave, what they should eat, and how long they could stay. The father even suggested that I needed to discipline my children more strictly. One afternoon, when I asked the kids to go inside after they had been playing for hours, the mother confronted me about it. She accused me of being too harsh and said that the kids needed more freedom to enjoy their childhood. At that point, I snapped. I politely but firmly told them to stay out of my personal affairs. And after that, I made it clear I wasn't interested in their advice or interference. Eventually, they moved out, but the experience left me feeling violated and wary of over-involved neighbors. I learned to always set clear boundaries when it comes to your personal life and to never let anyone cross them, no matter how friendly they may seem at first. Story 21. It's amazing how one person can turn a peaceful living situation upside down. I never imagined I'd have a neighbor who would make me question whether I was living in a sitcom or a nightmare. It all began when a young couple moved in next door. At first, they seemed like a typical couple, polite, friendly, and always waving when I passed by. But that politeness didn't last long. Within a few weeks of their move, the noise started. The couple had a tendency to leave their windows open, which meant that their every conversation was broadcasted into my home. It wasn't just normal chatting either. They'd argue about anything and everything, from who left the trash out to more personal issues, and even complaints about their family. The worst part was how loud they were. These weren't quiet arguments. These were shouting matches. I'd often hear every word of their conversations, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. They didn't care if I was in my living room or in my bedroom. They simply carried on, oblivious to the fact that I could hear everything. I thought maybe it was just a phase or a one-time thing, but it didn't end. It continued almost every day, sometimes during the late hours of the night, and I found myself walking around the house with earplugs in just to get a few hours of peace. But one night, things got worse. I was trying to sleep when I heard a particularly loud argument. This time, things got physical. It was so loud that I immediately called the police. When they arrived, the couple was still screaming at each other. They were told to keep it down and warned about disturbing the peace. After that, things calmed down for a while, but the damage was already done. Every time I heard raised voices, I couldn't help but feel stressed and anxious. After a few months of this, I decided it was best to move. The final straw was when they began hosting late-night gatherings. They would invite friends over and play loud music well into the early hours of the morning. The music was so loud that it rattled my windows. When I knocked on their door to ask them to lower the volume, they brushed me off with rude comments, telling me to go back to bed. I ended up calling the authorities yet again, and after a few more complaints, they were eventually evicted. Though I was glad to see them go, it took a long time for me to regain my peace of mind after living next to them. Story 22. I've never had much luck with neighbors, but the ones I had during my college years were the absolute worst. I lived in a shared apartment complex, and while most people were pretty respectful, there was one neighbor who made life unbearable. The guy, who we'll call Brad, was a complete disaster of a neighbor. Brad was a heavy drinker and didn't care who knew it. He'd throw loud parties several times a week. They'd go on until 3 or 4 in the morning with music blasting and people shouting. The worst part was that the parties were usually filled with intoxicated people, many of whom would stumble into the hallway, making the whole building smell like beer and cigarettes. I could hear every word of their shouting, and it felt like they were right in my room. The first time I tried to talk to him about it, he was completely dismissive. I knocked on his door at around 2 a.m., hoping he would lower the volume. He answered with a slurred, "What's the problem, dude?" and then closed the door in my face. The next day, he came over to apologize, but that didn't last long. He continued to host parties and often laughed when I mentioned the noise. It seemed like he had no regard for anyone else in the building. Things took a turn for the worse when I came home one night and found my front door kicked in. Someone had apparently broken into the apartment. The police later told me that it had been one of Brad's partygoers who had gotten drunk and decided to start a fight. I couldn't believe it. It felt like I was living in a war zone. I had to change my locks and my rent was increased to cover the damages, though I never received any apology from Brad. The tipping point came when one of his parties ended with a fight that resulted in broken glass and furniture being thrown out onto the balcony. I finally called the landlord and demanded that something be done. After several warnings, Brad was evicted from the building. Even though he left, it was a long time before I felt comfortable living there again. The experience taught me that living near the wrong kind of person can feel like an endless nightmare. Story 23. I've had some interesting experiences with neighbors, but one in particular really sticks out. I was living in a townhouse complex at the time, and at first, everything seemed fine. However, things took a sharp turn the moment I noticed the neighbor next door's strange behavior. At first, I thought he was just quirky, but as time passed, it became apparent that he was far more than just a little off. His house was constantly filled with items that spilled into his yard. Old furniture, broken TVs, piles of what seemed to be garbage, and even abandoned cars. But it wasn't just the state of his property that made him a bad neighbor. It was the way he acted. He'd sit on his front porch staring at our house, watching every move we made. It made my wife and me uncomfortable, but we tried not to make it an issue. Then things started to escalate. The guy would come over to our yard uninvited, often to check on the plants or to talk about the neighborhood. We barely knew the guy, so it felt invasive. One afternoon, he even came to our door and asked if he could borrow our lawnmower. He promised to return it the next day, but of course he didn't. Instead, he kept it for weeks, and when we asked for it back, he made up some excuse about it being broken. One day, while my wife and I were sitting on the porch, he came over with his dog, which was barking incessantly. The dog was clearly not being trained, and it wouldn't stop jumping and running around. The man didn't seem to care, but I finally had to ask him to take the dog inside, as it was distracting and upsetting. He seemed to get angry and told me that I shouldn't be so uptight, and that people like me just don't appreciate good company. It only got worse from there. He began yelling at us from his yard for ruining the neighborhood vibe, and even called the HOA on us for having too many flowers. I ended up reporting him to the HOA for the mess on his property and the constant interruptions to our privacy. After several warnings, the HOA stepped in and eventually forced him to clean up his yard and keep his dog inside. He wasn't evicted, but we didn't have to deal with his invasions anymore. It was a huge relief, but it still feels strange to think back on how intrusive and bizarre that situation was. Story 24. Living in an apartment complex has its perks, but the thin walls and shared spaces can lead to some tense situations. A few years ago, I was living in a 2-bedroom unit with my girlfriend, and our neighbors weren't exactly what I'd call ideal. The apartment directly above ours was rented by a young man named Jason. At first, he seemed fine, quiet, kept to himself, and didn't cause any issues. But it didn't take long for us to notice that something was off. He had some strange habits. It started with the noise. Not just the occasional sound of footsteps or furniture moving, but something much worse. Jason would pace back and forth for hours on end, dragging heavy objects across the floor. We could hear it clearly through the ceiling. Sometimes it sounded like he was rearranging furniture every other day. One night, things took a darker turn. Around 3 a.m., we were woken up by loud banging and thumping from above. At first, I assumed it was just another instance of him rearranging his furniture. But then, the noise began to sound more like something heavy being thrown around. My girlfriend and I were both awake by this point, and we heard shouting, Jason's voice, muffled but unmistakable, along with what sounded like things being smashed. Frightened, I decided to call the police. They arrived quickly and knocked on Jason's door. He opened it and seemed completely calm, almost as if nothing had happened. The police couldn't find any physical evidence of damage, but they told him to keep it down and warned him about disturbing the peace. It wasn't the first time we had heard strange sounds, but it was the last straw. We filed a formal complaint with the building management. When Jason found out, he became aggressive, claiming that we were ruining his life. Eventually, the building management took action and sent him an eviction notice. After he moved out, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The peace and quiet returned, but I will never forget how terrifying it was to have someone living above us who seemed completely out of touch with reality. Story 25. When we moved into our new house, the neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet, friendly, and everyone looked out for each other. But it didn't take long before I realized that not everyone shared the same definition of neighborly. Our next-door neighbors, an older couple, seemed pleasant enough at first. They'd wave when we saw them and even offer to help with our yard work, which was nice. But soon, I began to notice their constant intrusiveness. They would come over uninvited, often bringing unsolicited advice. It started with small things like how to prune our bushes and where to plant flowers, but soon, it escalated to more personal matters. They began offering their opinions on our lifestyle choices, such as when we should mow the lawn or how much we should be spending on groceries. They would knock on our door at least twice a week, just to check in or to chat about the good old days. The tipping point came when I caught them walking around our backyard while we were at work. Apparently, they had been doing it for weeks, checking out our garden and backyard setup. When I confronted them, they explained that they just wanted to make sure everything was in order. It became clear that their constant visits were more about controlling our space than actually being helpful. I had to set firm boundaries and told them that I appreciated their help but didn't need it. After that, they started to back off, but it was a hard lesson in how boundaries with neighbors can be so easily overlooked. Eventually, they moved, and things became much more peaceful. The experience taught me that while friendliness is great, there's a fine line between being helpful and being invasive. Story 26. I had lived in the same neighborhood for years, and for the most part, everything was peaceful, until the new tenants moved into the house next door. At first, they seemed like a quiet, normal family. There was a husband, a wife, and 2 young children. But after a few weeks, things started to unravel. It started with the noise. They didn't seem to have any concept of quiet hours. They would throw loud parties every weekend, sometimes starting as early as 2 p.m., and they wouldn't stop until the early hours of the morning. The music blared. Their kids would run around screaming, and they often had people over who made a scene in the front yard. I thought, maybe it's just a one-time, but it wasn't. The real issue came when I went over to talk to them about it. I knocked on their door, and when the wife answered, I politely asked if they could keep the noise down after 10 p.m., as it was disrupting my ability to sleep. She looked at me, smirked, and said, "We're just having fun. If you don't like it, move." I was stunned, but tried to remain calm. I mentioned that it was a shared neighborhood, and it was important to consider other people. Her response was simply, "Maybe you should have chosen a different house." The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. The noise continued, and I noticed that they began parking in front of my driveway, forcing me to park on the street. Every time I tried to address these issues, the response was always the same: rude, dismissive, and downright hostile. It reached a point where I could hardly sleep on weekends, and I was avoiding going outside because I knew they'd make a scene if I approached them. Finally, I filed a formal complaint with the Homeowners Association, which resulted in a few warnings for them. When those didn't work, I escalated the issue to the local authorities due to noise complaints. It wasn't until they were fined and warned with the possibility of eviction that they finally quieted down. They moved out a few months later, and the relief was immense. I never realized how much a bad neighbor could affect your quality of life until I had to endure those months of chaos. Didn't take it well, but I couldn't live like that anymore. I learned the hard way that some neighbors can be too much of a good thing.